Welcome back to Hobby with Ollie, where I've decided, upon receipt of probably the most models that I've ever had at any one time, it's time to paint them yellow. What could go wrong? Today we're going to be focusing on painting up the Terminator Captain from the Leviathan box. This is a really cool new sculpt and a cool new reimagining of one of the first miniatures that I ever got when I got into Warhammer 40,000. Look at him. I mean, this guy's got a thunder hammer, but there he is. Look. Captain Carlian. We're also going to be painting this guy up as a Lamenter. These are a member of the Cursed Founding and one of the unluckiest Space Marine chapters, possibly most unlucky people in the entirety of the Imperium. But that's only a superstition and there's no way that will impact anything about our painting today, right? Right? Let's start off by building this guy. I unboxed him and all of the characters come on a single sprue, no more messing around with kind of finding different bits on loads of different sprues, and they're all push fit, which is going to be an absolute godsend when it comes to sub-assemblies in a bit. We're starting off with an airbrush prime and I'm going to prime with a white base coat. After the white prime, I pulled the head off the model because it was quite wedged in and I wanted to make sure that I could paint it separately. Unfortunately, this was the last time that I ever saw this Terminator Captain's head. There's a chance it may have been eaten by a dog, dropped on the floor, swept up into a hoover. Now, I'm not entirely sure what happened to it, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it and sort it out a bit later. For now, Past Ollie is going to continue in blissful ignorance with painting the yellow armor. I started off with flat yellow from Vallejo through the airbrush. Having it in sub-assemblies here allowed me to get at it from all different angles and make sure that I got most of it painted. Though I would say I came to this a little bit too late and maybe could have done this when I was doing the priming stage. For the next models in the box, I'll be doing that instead. Next up, I used orange brown mixed with yellow ochre. I was trying to apply this in such a way as it's going to indicate that there's a little bit of a change in the color as you get towards those recesses. I then used pure orange brown for the darkest areas. The recesses like the armpits, around the belly area where it's kind of got a recess away from the armor and the chest panels, and then also under the area where the cloak is going to be covering. Now, some of the orange brown had gotten where I didn't want it to be, so I used a bit of flat yellow through the airbrush to kind of smooth the transition between the two. You can do this without an airbrush, it's just going to require a bit of glazing. This requires thinning down your paint with quite a lot of water and then wicking off that excess water onto a cloth or onto a piece of kitchen towel. Then what you're going to do is you are going to slowly move up and down between those two areas, effectively creating like a very thin layer of paint that's going to just tint lighter colors or is going to lighten darker colors so that they can kind of match more evenly. Next, I moved on to panel lining, which is going to really make the yellow armor pop. For this, I used flat brown from Vallejo. Now, this is a bit of a lengthy process. Get a really small brush and nice thin paint. You're then going to be running this into all the kind of panel lines and any areas where armor panels join together, as well as any areas where things like parchment or anything else touches that yellow armor. This will help to give you a really clear definition between the different areas of the model, which will help you a lot when coming to painting in a moment. This is one of the things that is indicative of the heavy metal style, where they have everything very, very neatly categorized out so that you can tell at a glance what everything is, which is just perfect when you're looking at something on a gaming table. I then did a few highlights with some lemon yellow and then a little bit of off-white just on the sharpest corners. Here you can see an example on the leg of this Marine. We're going to paint in between the armor panels now, where we've got the sort of webbing that goes between the different parts of the armor. For this, I decided on a nice neutral grey. I don't want it to attract too much attention away from that poppy yellow. This was another place where sub-assemblies came in absolutely clutch, allowing me to get that grey into all of the required areas. If you do make any mistakes at any point during the process, whether that's using the brown for the panel lining or when you're doing any of the other colours in future steps, you just need to come back in with off-white to paint in your color and then match as closely as you can with your yellow tones. If it's in the dark parts, use the orange-brown. If it's in one of the lighter parts, either use flat yellow, yellow ochre, or maybe even lemon yellow if you're on the very tips. With the armor done, it's time to go full on with our paintbrush and move on to the metallics. I started off with the gold, and one of the really interesting things about the Lamenters color schemes that I could find online is that they do still tend to have a gold chest eagle, even in spite of having that yellow armor. So you really need to be careful about making sure there's enough definition between the two elements. For actually painting the gold, I used a brass from Vallejo. This is definitely not the right name for this. Vallejo. If you're watching, Mr. Vallejo, change your paint name. I shaded over the brass with Reichland Flesh Shade, which is going to get into all the little recesses, for example on that chest Aquila, but I was still relying on my flat brown outline in order to give me definition from the armor panels. At this point, I wanted to get a better idea of how it's going to sit in context, as I'm not used to doing this kind of thing, so I decided to paint the belt of the model black. Once I got that, I realised that I needed to add a few highlights onto the metallics. I started off with a 50-50 mix of brass and silver, which makes light gold. I think that's alchemy pretty much. And I used this on the upward facing areas and sharp edges. I then took pure silver and used this on a smaller sub area of what I just painted. With the metals looking nice and shiny, it's time to move on to the cloak. Now I started off with a mix of Vallejo red, which is a bit more of a pinky tone than something like a Mephiston red, and I mixed this with black in equal parts. I base coated all over with this, before then highlighting with more red added in. I wanted to make sure to leave the recesses with that darker colour showing through. By using just a slight change in tone, you're going to keep a really soft, smooth gradient between the colours that you're adding in here. Lastly, I added some white into the mix, which makes a slightly more pinky colour, and used this for my highlights around the edges of the cloak and any upraised folds. Jumping to another of the details that you're going to see all over this model, let's have a look at the purity seals. Now a recipe for these starts with 3 paints: brown sand, dark sand, and then off-white. I start by base coating with brown sand. Once that's established, I'm then going to use my dark sand for a highlight colour. This is going to be focused around the top edges, any pointy bits of scroll, and then also along the flat section of the scroll where it kind of folds up. Lastly, it's going to be a small highlight with off-white. This is going to be focused on the very corners of the scrolls, as well as all the way down the edges. A little bit of red, which is probably closer to Screamer Pink from Citadel, for the wax seals, and then a highlight for these of red mixed with off-white. Now this guy is clad in tactical dreadnought armor, and with the bad luck of the Lamenters, he's going to be needing every single bit of protection that this armor can offer. So let's paint up his Crux Terminatus. I started off with a medium sea grey, which I base coated all over these elements. I then went on to an overall shade of non-oil. This is going to run into all those little recesses between where you have the little lines going across the top. I then highlighted up with medium sea grey mixed with silver grey in a 50-50 mix. This was focused onto all of the upraised areas, avoiding getting it in any of the areas where my non-oil had pooled. Lastly, towards the top of the Crux Terminatus, I used pure silver grey. Before we move on to the Lamenter's signature element, the shoulder pad, let me know what you're painting up your Leviathan box as. Are you crazy like me and you've decided to go for painting up 80 odd Lamenters, or are you painting something a little bit easier? Does the Codex Astartes support your action? Let me know in the comments down below. We're just going to do one more thing on the parchments before we move on. That's going to be filling in our little writing that's going to be sitting on the scrolls. For this, I use micro pens. These are tiny little fine liners that will let you get a lot more dexterity than you can with a paintbrush. At least that's how I find it anyway. Some people are just amazing with a paintbrush. Damn you, Darren Latham! Just make sure that you're always putting this onto dry paint, and you want to give it plenty of time, a blast with a hairdryer, and make sure that you're then gentle with the pen so you don't scratch off any of the paint. What it's definitely worth doing is after you have used your micro pens, put a layer of matte varnish over the top, because these can come out a little bit glossy. Right, let's have a look at that Lamenter's shoulder pad. I started off painting this with silver grey, and then some black lines in a grid pattern. Onto this, I sketched a circle where we're going to have our heart motif. However, it's still got the grid lines going across it, so I filled it in with my grey once again. I next moved on to the horizontal lines across the shoulder pads. Maybe I should have done this first before filling in that circle, as it would probably have looked a little bit neater. And then it was just a case of filling in alternate squares black. For a first attempt, I'm pretty happy with how this has turned out, though I'll probably try and measure it out a little bit more neatly in future. For the heart, I painted this with carmine red. Seems like an appropriately named colour. And then I used this same colour for the little blood drop. Now, the way that I found was easiest to do this was to draw a straight line and then a V shape for the heart, before then filling in the little curves at the top. Now, this wasn't perfect first time, so I came back in and sorted it out with a little bit more silver grey. Next, let's move on to the bolter. I started off by painting it pretty much all black. I then added silver to the ammo drum underneath, and copper for the bullet casings. Next, it was Nuln oil all over all of these elements to tie them together, and then some highlights with silver for the silver parts. I highlighted the casing of the gun with a neutral grey. Alright, just a few more bits to go. Let's move on to the power sword. Firstly, fully shade and highlight the sword. So paint it up as silver, get your little silver edges, and make sure you give it a blast with Nuln oil as well into all the recesses. I then used dark blue in a random pattern to show the bounces of the electricity going up the blade. I next used medium blue in much the same manner, but it's going to stick to a smaller kind of trench inside of what we've designed previously. Now it's on to the lightning, and you'll need a steady hand and a small brush here. We're going to add some sky blue into that medium blue from before and use it to sketch out our lightning. We're then going to go inside of this lightning even more carefully with pure sky blue. The next thing you want to do is you want to blend everything together a little bit. Our colours are popping really nicely, but we'll actually come back in and re-establish them after a bit of a blending step. For this, I used my dark blue, but this time thinned down to a glaze consistency. I glazed this all over the blade so that everything looks like it's got a sort of blue sheen and that sort of energy is coursing through the metal and not just through the lightning. With this, I did need to re-establish my sky blue layers for the lightning, and then I also went one step further and applied white to any areas where the lightning is kind of forking off or where it hits certain parts of the blade, like at the bottom and also on the edge of the blade, which is going to be doing the damage. Speaking of doing the damage, let's move on to looking at the base, where there is a Tyranid who has met an untimely end at the hands of this mighty captain. I primed the base with white, and then I used an off-white in order to get a colour that I can come back to if I make any mistakes. I also used the Tyranid Leviathan scheme that you can see from my previous video to get this guy all painted up. We're using dark purple for the carapace, and then I actually used a slightly redder mix than I did in the previous example of my Leviathan painting. This was just thinned down Vallejo red, which I washed all over that sort of skin flesh nastiness. I then painted the rest of the base with a green-grey before coming to the final finishing touches to this guy. If you've been in a battle with a Tyranid, there is going to be gore, ichor, blood everywhere. So I wanted to make sure I got that in place. I used some browns, vermilions, and many different red tones through the airbrush in order to establish some blood spatter. I wanted to make sure I got some of this up onto the model as well as around his feet. Finishing off, we're going to paint the head. I used Bugman's Glow as my base coat. I then shaded this with Reichland Flesh Shade, highlighted with added off-white, and then for the bruised, sort of scarred side that he has on this particular head, I used Druki Violet as well as other red tones in order to indicate the sort of damage to that side may be sustained in facing the Screamer Killer, which he's now got on his base. I used a dot for the other eye, and we're ready to check out this Lamenters Captain in all his glory. Thank you so much for watching this week's episode as I embark on yet another new paint scheme for my army. Have you ever tried painting Lamenters before? How did it go? How did you find painting those shoulder pads? Or do you prefer using transfers? If you are looking at picking up any hobby supplies, be sure to check out my link to Element Games in the description down below. You'll get a discount on your hobby products. I get a small kickback at no additional expense to you, so it's a win-win for both of us. Otherwise, if you are looking to support the channel, the best thing you can do is to continue watching my videos. I've got a load of stuff here from the last year or so hopefully there's something that tickles your fancy. Thank you all so much for watching. My name has been Ollie, this has been my hobby, and I'll see you next time.